But I would say that if I had to give a lecture on China, the title of my lecture on China will be, Can Societies Have Human Responsibilities Without Human Rights? Because Chinese society emphasizes responsibilities more than it emphasizes rights. I mean, that's a fact, as you know. And by the way, just to give you an example of this, I was doing some research for this lecture. So I went back to a wonderful 4-volume collection, which I bought in the 1980s. It's called the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And of course, I looked up all the Western liberal philosophers like Bentham. Bentham had, who's not a very well-known Western philosopher. There were 5 densely packed pages on Bentham in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Then I went to Confucius, and Confucius had less than 1 page in the Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I tell that story because what exactly is the heart and kernel of Chinese philosophy is something that I think is still being debated and still being discussed. But there's absolutely no doubt, and in fact, even in the half page on Confucius, what it emphasized in that half page on Confucius is that every human being has got obligations. So it's obligations to filial piety, to your family, to your village, to your society, and so on and so forth. And indeed, I noticed in that half page on Confucius, there was no mention of rights anywhere. It's all about obligations and responsibilities. So I think Chinese society is obviously structured very differently from Western societies, but at the same time, it's also clear that all the Western revolutions on human rights have affected Chinese society. And to give you the most powerful example of this, when Chairman Mao Zedong said that women hold up half the sky, that was a very powerful statement. He was saying that women are equal to men. Now, that in Chinese society, in Confucian philosophy, is wrong. Men are here, women are here. But Mao said men and women are equal. And so that's a profound change in Chinese society that Mao made. But that was an infusion of Western philosophy into Chinese society. So Chinese society has actually changed fundamentally also in many areas. But how exactly China will find its balance is something that I suspect so many China scholars can speak about more competently than I can. But I think in Chinese society too, clearly, you need to focus more on rights and less on responsibilities.
Let's open up to questions. I'm going to look around the audience, but I just want to take a couple from our audience online. So, and in actual fact, there were a couple that lead on from what you were just talking about on the influence of the Chinese philosophical tradition on the current Chinese government in the way that you talked about John Rawls in the West. So we had a question from Jenny Wong asking exactly that, sort of what should we make of the Chinese philosophical tradition and Confucianism in the context of what you're talking about. And then another question about whether this is a genuine attempt to create a new ethical society or a distraction. So I wondered if you just might say a little bit more about your sense of how you talked about the philosophical tradition in the West and Rawls and other thinkers and how that fed down into real world policy. How do you see that similar conversation happening in China?
Well, as you all know, I mentioned I haven't studied Chinese philosophy, Chinese traditions. I want to sort of, whatever I say, please check with the China scholars and experts. But I would say that there are 2 big things happening simultaneously in Chinese society today. One is, of course, China's emergence as a modern society. So there is Chinese society today in terms of the behavior of its people, in terms of its attitude, in terms of its, I guess, what the Germans would call Weltanschauung. It's a modern worldview. So if you meet young Chinese, they are involved in technology, they're engaged with the world, they're very much part of the 21st century. And so that integration with a modern worldview is one big thing that's happening in China. And at the same time, what is also happening in China, in my view, is that there's an amazing Chinese cultural renaissance taking place, where the Chinese are reconnecting back to their roots. And that, as you know, they lost their contact with their roots through two powerful forces, historical forces. One was, of course, in many ways, the humiliation by the West in the century of humiliation. And the Chinese obviously were trampled, lost their self-confidence. They felt lost. They didn't know what was happening to them. And then you had, of course, also the Chinese Communist period, where for a while they tried to bury Confucius, right? Confucius disappeared in Mao's time. But now Confucius is coming back. And not just Confucius, all the rich history of China is coming back. So you have, therefore, a remarkable, like a political and social experiment happening in China today, where on the one hand, China is integrating itself into the modern mainstream of the world, on the other hand, rediscovering its old historical roots. And how these two integrate and play itself out, frankly, I'm not sure how it's going to happen. But I can tell you that just a small story. The last time I was in Davos was in January 2020. And for some reason, I was put into the Global Future Council on China. And in that Global Future Council on China, there were 12 or 13 of us. 10 were women, 3 were men. And when the session finished, I came back and I told my wife, I've just attended the best session in Davos in January 2020. I'd never seen such dynamic young women as these 10 young Chinese women. They were brilliant, they were smart, they knew exactly what was happening in the world, and they were discussing issues with tremendous clarity and a tremendous sense of optimism and dynamism. And I said, wow, this is absolutely amazing. So this is what the China story is, therefore, this sort of discovery of the past, injection of the modern.